I often get asked about the stage that I use in my studio. It's basically a box that I painted black on the inside, cut a couple holes in it for lights, and right now for a background I have a piece of old canvas tacked up inside. Today I'm going to be painting a Star Wars Stormtrooper mask, and as you can see it's a white object on a white background. I've got a piece of orange paper tacked up on the right side to throw some orange reflected light on my object, which you can see here in this close-up of my model. White objects can be pretty challenging to paint, and that's why I use different materials to throw some colored reflected light onto them. It gives me a little something to hang my hat on when I'm mixing the colors up. So I do a quick layout with cad red mixed with some mineral spirits. Once that's done, I start mixing up my colors. I decide to go for an orange-blue complementary color scheme. So I mix up some orange and then I add cobalt blue to it to cool it down. And I mix a few values out of that mixture. Next, I take the same two colors, but this time I mix a slightly warmer version. These colors will be used for the shadowed side of the mask. I decide I want the light side of the mask to be a very light value that's sort of based on green. So I mix up some green and add lots of white to it. I want to be sure that these light values are dark enough so that white highlights will show up on them. I decide to go for a warm neutral background, so I mix up some orange and add blue. And then I mix up my cast shadow colors, which have to be kind of warm because of that orange reflected light that I have being thrown on it. And then I need a little bit of chromatic black for the details on the Stormtrooper mask. I start with the darks and I just start laying in some color. The reason to start with the darks is because I'm painting on a white panel and dark colors actually show up better, obviously. And so it's much easier to see what I'm working on early on. And then I can start adding some lighter tones. I'm starting on the shadowed side and kind of working back and forth between the cools in the core shadows and the relatively warm reflected light that the orange piece of paper is throwing onto the object. This simple Halloween mask is really a much more complicated form than you might imagine. It's got a lot of different undulations and surfaces. When I get to the cast shadow, I want to make sure it's a darker value than the right edge of the mask. I want that reflected light to really show up. I think that using a greenish tint for the light side was a good idea. It's a little bit cooler and I think it contrasts nicely with that warm reflected light. Because the light areas on the mask are kind of on the cool side, I want my background to be relatively warm. So I use a version of the color that I use for the cast shadow. It's kind of a light orange neutral mixture that I made up. And then I block in my foreground, which is lighter still since the light from my overhead is hitting it a little bit more directly. And then I just spackle the rest on with my knife. Once the background's in, it's largely a matter of just cleaning up the dark accents and placing the highlights in. I'm using flake white for these highlights. It's a little bit warmer than titanium white, and it's going to work out really well on this cool greenish color that I mixed up. In the past, I've mixed my light values too light on a white object. And then when you start to add your highlights, they just don't show up because your light values are there's just not enough contrast. I'm pretty glad that I showed some restraint and I made my lights a little bit darker because these highlights are working out pretty well. I'm happy with how this is coming along. Once I get the last of the highlights put on, I think it's just about done and I decide to call it a day.